Hi, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining what is going to be our final COVID webinar. This is 3 years in the making. We began with a weekly series of COVID webinars in the spring of 2020. The purpose was to support our friends and clients with legal information. And here we are 3 years later with the final one, which is really great. For us, it did become a regular touch point with one another, especially because we'd both prepare and then get on, and it really helped us to get through, separate and apart from hopefully providing some help from a legal perspective as well. We want to thank you all for your support and encouragement in doing these. Even today is somewhat of an offshoot of some encouragement. I mentioned to someone, oh, there's a little more COVID development. We're thinking about a webinar, but we're not sure. And we got feedback, oh no, you should definitely do one, even if they're just being nice. Here we are. So we're at one final COVID webinar. That doesn't mean Franczek webinars are at an end. We still will be doing our regular monthly webinars, so please join us for those. And I suppose if the worst happens and COVID requires further webinars, we will be back, but I think we're all really hoping and optimistic that's not going to be the case. So then turning to the topic at hand, Governor Pritzker's disaster proclamation declaring the public health emergency due to COVID-19 ended on May 11th, 2023, so last week. As a result, COVID leave rights and other rights that were contingent on that emergency declaration ended. And so we wanted to just do a quick check-in. We're planning for 30 minutes today to talk through some of the implications of that true end to, from a legal perspective, at least the COVID period. So with that, I want to introduce, I think everyone on this probably knows Nicki Bazer, one of my partners, and Amy Dickerson, also one of my partners at Franczek. So thank you both for joining.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jen. And it's good to be with everybody, and certainly very happy that this is hopefully, knock on wood, the last webinar on COVID that we will do. And it's been such a pleasure and a privilege to be able to be with all of you every week at one point for weeks and weeks on end to get us through this pandemic together. So I think the most impactful likely change, and the one that I think everybody is sort of top of mind for everyone, are the COVID leave days. And so the COVID leave days for employees at school district and charter schools will no longer be in effect. The employees will no longer be entitled to those paid leave days that were provided for under the school code. Those were only to be in effect during when a disaster declaration was in place. And as Jen has just mentioned, that was rescinded effective May 11th. So you should be careful, obviously, if someone was out for COVID prior to May 11th, they should still be given those days. But any absences after that, Amy and I will talk a little bit about MOUs, but if your district does not have any MOUs requiring those leave days, that entitlement is no longer in effect.
Great. So yeah, Amy, maybe that does lead into any MOUs or policies or district specific things that were worked out. What is the guidance on those?
Yeah, so we know that many of you have, adopted over the last 3 years, perhaps policies, procedures, or entered into MOUs with your applicable collective bargaining units that were related to COVID-19. Those may have addressed, very specific issues or quite a number of issues, whether they related to vaccinations, shield testing, notifications of positive diagnoses or absences, or perhaps other issues that may have even been related to the governor's executive orders related to COVID-19. So, first and foremost, those should be reviewed. and pulled out. If the language in any of those documents are contingent upon the governor having declared a disaster due to a public health emergency, those may very well then automatically, cease to be in effect. So work with legal counsel to make sure you're clear on what the effect of those is, depending upon how those are phrased. Of course, just because there's a reference to that doesn't mean it may automatically cease to be in effect. So we need to look at that. If they aren't contingent on there being a disaster declaration, then there should, this is a time to review those and determine whether there's still, reason to have any of those in effect, or if, you need to review those and revisit and make modifications, and where applicable to meet with your collective bargaining representatives, to make adjustments there if need be. Nicki, I don't know if there's anything further to add in terms of what you've seen practically.
Yeah, I think the only other possible flavor of an MOU might be that it expires at the end of this school year. So again, just like Amy mentioned with the disaster declaration, if you have an automatic rescission date of your MOU, that also obviously would be applicable. And I think Amy's advice is the right one. We need to make sure we're reviewing all of those up front and seeing where we're at in terms of what requirements we still need to carry out under those MOUs.
So the second hottest topic, I'll say, is, and I think people are even scared to ask sometimes, but do we have to do anything with symptoms? Do we have to do anything with testing? Should we? What is the status of how we deal with illness? Amy or Nicki, do you want to jump in there?
Sure, I can start. And I think this is, I want to tie this also to the conversation we're just having about leave days and MOUs, because I think we are already starting to see some union folks, if they don't have an MOU or it's expired or they want more days, they're starting to raise that as an additional issue, because there are still some guidance out there related to exclusion. So, the testing guidance is really, in terms of, we don't require a negative test for folks returning. I think the big issue still is there is still CDC guidance that speaks to this idea that if you test positive for COVID, you should isolate for 5 days before you return. Obviously, the way sort of I think about this really is that there's lots of guidance on the fact that if you are sick, you should not bring that illness into a school building. And, Amy and I were talking ahead of time about, the requirements around strep, the requirements around fever. So I sort of think of these in the same way. I'm not aware that there's, an enforcement mechanism now for this guidance. And I think it is guidance. And I think a lot of folks are still requiring that isolation for 5 days so that COVID is not spreading. Obviously, if you end up having an outbreak in your school, or there's more than there's a number of cases, there's a classroom that's impacted, obviously that may influence how you deal with isolation and exclusion with employees or with students.
Yeah, I think that's all right. And the only additional thing, we just kind of had, we obviously knew well in advance of last week and the 11th that this was going, the public health emergency would end, but it did just happen last week. So whether we see even, additional guidance, come out from IDPH or the CDC regarding some of the exclusion, recommendations or guidance around what those are following a positive diagnosis, that may occur too. So again, I think just, if anything, we just kind of keep our eyes out on that may help inform how you move forward.
Great.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one other issue that is dependent on this is the Open Meetings Act and fully virtual meetings, which had been permitted. Nicki, what do we do now?
Yeah, I know it's so sad to say, but our days of full virtual meetings are coming to a close, or have come to a close here. So the provision in the Open Meetings Act that allowed for fully virtual meetings was only permitted when there was a disaster declaration in place. Now that there's not, you are back to being required to have fully in-person board meetings. I always do like to remind folks, because this question does come up, there are some situations where an individual board member could participate remotely. That has always been in the Open Meetings Act, and well, I don't know always, but has been in recent memory. And essentially what you need is you need a quorum of board members to be physically present for the meeting. Then an absent member can participate remotely if they are remote for one of the statutorily recognized reasons. So those reasons are their own personal illness, a work-related, so their own personal business or work-related reason, or because of a public, they're traveling because of for the board, they're at a conference or the like for the board, or a family emergency. So it's obviously subject to your policy. You should check your board policies if there's a member that needs to be absent. But again, the idea of sort of a full board remote meeting is no longer in effect. A lot of boards, because of the requirements under the Open Meetings Act, and just for practical reasons, have been live streaming their meetings to allow more access. Obviously, that's not required, but I know that a lot of boards may continue to do that because they feel like it enables those folks who really can't get to the meeting to listen in. But that again will be your option and your choice at that point.
Yeah, we did get a question about if a school district or school encourages isolation for 5 days, are we responsible for special instruction during this time? I would say the only legal requirement for special instruction would be if the student qualifies for homebound, and that would not happen at 5 days. If the student has long COVID, symptoms that are anticipated to be over 10 days and has a medical certification, that's the only scenario where I can think of a legal requirement that would come into place, not just your routine, more routine now COVID incident, like one episode where the student will be back in 5 days.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding too, Jen, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you can think about this sort of like you think again about other illness where, if kids have access to work over, Google Classrooms, or they can reach out to their teacher to get homework and that sort of thing, but there's no specific special instruction for just those 5 days. Right.
It's not like at different periods of time we had to have instruction available for those being excluded for COVID. That requirement is not in place anymore. So one other issue, and then I'll get back to the questions in the Q&A, which definitely if people have questions, that's the right place to put them. We'll return to those. But Amy, evaluation related and teacher dismissal issues, how does this impact those?
Yeah, so as many of you may know, there are various provisions that were in the school code related to teacher evaluation ratings, teacher dismissal hearings, remediation plans, all that were allowed for certain exceptions when there was a disaster declaration. And so those are no longer applicable. So, those include when it comes to, dismissal hearings, there were certain exceptions that allowed for those to be done remotely, or to allow for, if necessary, a change in the hearing officer. So those would just no longer be applicable. There's a provision that allows, when it comes to any teachers who are under a remediation plan, if in-person instruction had been suspended, there was an ability to waive those remediation plans. That would no longer be permissible or applicable. And then there were certain provisions with regard to if a teacher was not evaluated. We currently have provisions in place where if a teacher isn't evaluated during a time when they should be evaluated, that there would be a default for that teacher to a proficient rating for the purposes of either attaining tenure or for the purposes of putting together your honorable dismissal list for RIFs. While those provisions are still in place, there were some additional provisions that allowed for exceptions to that for any teachers who may have previously gotten an excellent rating the year prior, that for those teachers, if there were during the time where there would be a disaster declaration, their default would go to excellent. That is no longer applicable. So we go back to how it was prior to that.
Great. All right, so the next question in the Q&A is, would it be safe to receive guidance from our local health department for isolation requirements as far as we communicating to employees? And I would say yes. And if specifically you look at the IDPH guidance, that would still be the kind of state of the guidance. It encourages school districts and local health departments to work together and use their traditional processes and authorities. So you should work with that. That's absolutely the right approach, is to work with your local health department. Next question, and then this goes back to the virtual meetings. If they have a board member that's traveling for personal reasons, such as taking a child to college, could they still attend virtually? Nicki, do you want to?
Sure. Yeah, that is not an approved statutory reason. Again, there are really just the three in the Open Meetings Act: personal illness or disability, employment purposes, or the business of the board, or a family or other emergency. I don't think taking a student to college really qualifies as a family emergency. So I would probably recommend against that person being able to participate remotely. Obviously they can listen in, but they can't actually vote at the meeting.
And then let's see, another question. A school district that currently allows students who are out with COVID to Zoom in, that the school wants to end this, and they're asking, can we? I'm going to say yes, but Nicki, do you have some thoughts about that situation?
So, I'm sorry. I thought the question was about board members Zooming in. I don't know if it's about students or board members. So, so if the question is about board members, the answer is no. They need to be physically present, or they need to be, if they are participating by Zoom, it has to be for one of those three reasons that we just went through. On the student one, yes, Jen, I defer your judgment on that.
No. Yeah, so I read it as a student question, and in that case, you never had to. This has created endless problems. I'll just put it that way in terms of anyways, yes, you can end that. And although I know parents love it, and so it might not be so, your issue is going to be community relations, not legal. Let me put it that way. Okay, next question. Can we send an email to staff and give them a cutoff date to submit any requests to get their sick days restored? Thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think practically you probably could do that. I mean, at some point, they should be putting in for those days and telling you, so there should be no delay. I think this is in reference to the fact that if someone took a COVID leave day before May 11th, they're entitled to. I know most school districts and schools have, those days get put in right away. So I think you could just flag for folks, if there's any days that they think they're entitled to prior to May 11th, they need to get them in by the end of the school year. There's nothing specifically legal that allows you or doesn't allow you to do that. I think from a practical standpoint, it's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I would just say, obviously, if there was an issue that arose with regard to that, then obviously check in with legal counsel, or you may have to work with your collective bargaining unit, given just the way the statute is written in terms of, the ability to get those days, prior to May 11th.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And the next question we have is about what about screenings and Binax tests? Can we still do them?
Sure. I mean, there's no reason that you can't continue to do testing if that's something that your district or your school has always offered, and you want to continue doing it. There's no reason that you can't, but there's no requirement that you have to. So that's really up to you as a local school authority.
And then again, I think I would hear just a reminder, if you're doing those, think about, is there anything that you have, put in place, whether it's an MOU or something procedure wise, where you have communicated that you would only be doing this during the time that there's this disaster declaration, because then obviously that we'll look at, because that will inform your decision as to how you would proceed.
Yeah. We were joking, or I was joking, my husband, every time my kids get a sniffle, he keeps giving them a COVID test. And I'm like, stop with the COVID test. I don't want to know. But anyways, next, we have a question about, are the 5 mental health days for students still intact, or was that bound to the disaster declaration? Amy, those are still intact, right?
Correct. Yeah, that was put into place separate, not contingent on the disaster declaration.
Okay. And then another question, any concerns about having IEP meetings remotely if the parents agree to it? No concerns with that at all. I would say it's still a predominant practice. There's several parents attorneys who I don't think they've been to an in-person IEP meeting still. Once they went remote, that's all they ask for. So you can absolutely, if there's agreement, to the same token, you don't, I don't think you have to. You can have your practice be, we hold in-person meetings. That's fine too. There's not a requirement either way. And it's not in the regulations haven't been updated. So when it talks about trying to get parent participation, it talks about phone conferences. There hasn't been any change to that. Although I think common sense would dictate if that's a good way to get parents to participate, then it would be a great thing to offer.
I would say that my favorite remote meeting development since COVID is the parent-teacher conference. Personally, I love it. I know some parents don't. I know some districts offer both. So hopefully, if there's someone from my district on there, hopefully that will continue. But I know these remote meetings do make it sometimes easier, especially for working parents who maybe can Zoom in but can't make it all the way to the district. So,
absolutely. Do local health departments in collaboration with school districts still have authority to support pauses in in-person instruction based on school outbreaks?
Oh gosh, we're sort of digging deep. So, I mean, there's still, the local authorities, there were no new authority that were given through COVID, in the sense that the local health authorities have various types of powers and authorities related to outbreaks of illness, right? And I'm not sure we have enough time to sort of go through all those in detail, but there could be, those authorities have not gone away with the governor's declaration. Obviously, again, as Jen said earlier, and Amy, I think it's a great idea to work with your local health authorities, get their updated guidance and information on how to approach things. I mean, again, hopefully we're not going to see any outbreaks of the kind of level where there would have to be a closure. So really, hopefully, the most we're talking about is sort of some cases in a classroom or in a building. And then in that case, I would sit down with your local authority and figure out the best approach. I have not heard of any situation recently, perhaps there have been some out there where there's been any discussion of a sort of a building-wide closure. So,
yeah. So another question, and we all kind of did a little dive in before this webinar to try to see what the current guidance actually is. So the question is asking us to clarify, is current guidance recommends the isolation for 5 days, but then the person asks, but we cannot require it, correct? And so first of all, I want to have Amy talk about, there was a moment yesterday where we looked for the dreaded flow chart. Yes. So Amy, tell us about that.
If I had a visual and could quickly share my screen, I would allow you all the same impact we had, where, if you go on ISB's website, they still have a COVID-19 related page, and there's a link to the decision tree that says it was last updated August of 2022. And when you click on it, at least yesterday, a big bright blue circle, I think it was blue, popped up that said page not found. So there was no decision tree that we saw, linked to, at least the link that ISB had up there. And from our look today, it looks that, it's not readily that we can see on IDPH's website. That said, I think Nicki, can speak to what the current guidance is there, despite it maybe not being on that official decision tree.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of an interesting question from a practical standpoint. I guess, districts can require people to stay home when they're ill. You certainly have the local authority from a health and safety perspective to require people to stay home. I think the more difficult question is just sort of enforcement of that. So you can certainly say, we're requiring folks to, stay out for the full 5 days. Whether people do that, whether they tell you they have COVID, I mean, we all know folks who have gone out with strep and taken only 2 days of their antibiotics and then come back, right? So it's, I think certainly school districts can still set rules in terms of illness. I think the enforcement is more complicated. I also think, you may then get a demand, well, if you're going to require this, then we need the days. So again, I don't think that this negates your authority as a school district to make these determinations. I do think the complicated part is just going to be, enforcement and keeping folks out. Again, if you start to see a cluster of cases, then, there may be more emphatic measures that you're going to want to take.
So one other issue we flagged is remote learning days versus e-learning days. Amy, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, essentially just we want to, the provisions in the school code that allowed for remote learning days contingent upon the disaster declaration, obviously aren't applicable anymore. But just as a reminder, schools can still use e-learning days so long as you're, have set that program up in place, in the way that the statute requires. That amendment to the school code that allowed for e-learning days to be used in certain circumstances actually went into effect prior to, the COVID pandemic and the disaster declaration, and is still in effect. So if you have specific questions about making sure that, your program is compliant, with those requirements, of course, do reach out.
Great. So I think that might be a good place to call it just a few minutes early. We want to thank everyone again for joining us. It's oddly bittersweet. I actually did enjoy these, even though it's connected to maybe something unpleasant, but please do continue to join us for our other webinars. You'll see us again, just hopefully not about COVID. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.